Hello! Okay, it's time for our last two chapters of No Talking by Andrew Clements. We've officially come to the end of the book. I hope you guys have liked it as we've been reading it. We are going to be starting with chapter 19, which has to do with Dave has went down to Mrs. Hiatt's office, and we were wondering what would happen to him as he headed down there. I think our chapter title is going to give you a good idea. So, chapter 19 is Apologies. There were 227 green tile squares on the hallway floor between the cafeteria and the school office. Dave counted each one to keep from thinking about what was going to happen next, but he thought about it anyway. Mrs. Chaplin pointed to the principal's door. Go right in. Dave knocked. He knew he didn't have to, but it bought him another 2 seconds of delay. Mrs. Hiatt said, "Come in," and Dave thought, at least she's not using her bullhorn. He opened the door, and she was standing with her back to him, looking out the windows into the school courtyard. Dave blurted out, "I'm sorry." And he said that because he knew he shouldn't have yelled at the principal, even if he had been right, which he still believed he was. He also apologized because he hoped it might save his life. Mrs. Hiatt turned around, and Dave was shocked to see the look on her face, because she wasn't mad. This is a picture of Mrs. Hiatt and Dave when he walks to the room. She almost looked like she'd been crying. Her nose was pink. She shook her head. "That's why I sent for you, so that I could say that. I'm the one who got angry, and I yelled first, and I set a terrible example. So I hope you'll forgive me." Dave couldn't remember the last time a grown-up had apologized to him. And to have the principal saying she was sorry, well, he could barely manage a nod at her. She nodded back and then paused and said, "So what are we going to do about this situation?" I'm not sure," said Dave. She frowned. "Please. You can talk freely in here. None of your friends can hear us." Dave shook his head. "Honor system." Mrs. Hyatt's eyebrows went up. "Oh, of course. Very admirable. Well, maybe you can answer some questions for me, just to get started." Dave said, "Sure. First of all, how did all this get going? Who started it?" David smiled. "Mahatma Gandhi." "Pardon me?" Mrs. Hiatt said. Dave said, "He stopped talking," the principal said. "And someone wanted to try that here at school, right?" Dave nodded and pointed at himself. "All my fault." "I see," she said. "And how did you learn about Gandhi?" He said, "Social studies report." "And why did he stop talking?" Dave shrugged. "To think more." "And you're not keeping silent, not totally. Why?" Dave thought for a moment and then said, "Respect for school." Which he knew was going to make him sound like a goody-goody, but it was true. He and his friends weren't trying to shut the school down, not at all. Mrs. Hiatt nodded slowly and said, "Oh." She seemed to be out of questions. And during that 3 or 4 seconds of silence, an idea jumped into Dave's mind. But he pushed it out. It was too outrageous. But the idea bounced into his head, and this time, Dave just blurted it out. "Want to join?" Mrs. Hiatt bunched her eyebrows together. "What do you mean?" "Join. Stop talking." She looked at Dave as if he had just told her to put on a grass skirt and dance the hula on the roof of the school bus. "Don't be silly. I'm the principal. Do you have any idea how many people I speak to every single day?" Dave pointed at the notepad on her desk. "May I?" She nodded, and he wrote, "You can say only 3 words in a row, and only if a teacher or a grown-up talks to you first, except you can talk to a kid first, because you're sort of a teacher, and no talking at all outside of school, honor system. And the whole thing's almost over anyway, just until tomorrow." Then Dave smiled up at her and said, "It's interesting." Mrs. Hiatt shook her head. "I could never." Dave put his hand like a traffic officer. "There! Stop! 3. Mrs. Hiatt smiled. It wasn't a principal's smile. Dave could tell. She was smiling a real person's smile. She smiled because she realized Dave had offered her something important. Just 5 minutes earlier, she had acted like a monster. But she wasn't, not really. Still, she had behaved terribly. Everyone in the cafeteria knew that, kids and grown-ups both. And news like that spreads quickly. So somehow she needed to remind everyone that she wasn't a monster, fast. And Dave had just offered her a way to become human again, because it's a well-known fact that monsters do not have a sense of humor. She tore Dave's sheet off the notepad and bent over her desk and did some writing of her own. She stepped quickly into the office and handed Mrs. Chaplin the paper. The secretary read it quickly and said, "And I should..." The principal held up one finger and said, "Type." Then she held up 2 fingers and said, "Duplicate." And then held up 3 fingers and said, "Distribute." And Mrs. Chaplin said, "Got it." Then, turning to Dave, the principal said, "Ready, set, go." Dave's head was swimming, but he managed to say, "Where?" She was already out the office door, and over her shoulder, Mrs. Hiatt said, "To the cafeteria." And here we are on the last chapter. So our last chapter is chapter 20, and it is the winners. Who's going to win the contest, the boys or the girls? Let's find out. At this point, it might be fun to tell how Dave followed the principal back to the cafeteria, how Mrs. Hiatt apologized to the whole 5th grade by trading 3-word phrases back and forth with Dave, who also apologized, and describing the looks on the faces of all those 5th graders in the cafeteria, not to mention Mrs. Marlowe and the rest of the staff. That might be fun too. Or it might be interesting to tell how Mrs. Hiatt called an all-school assembly 5 minutes later by chiming the school intercom and then saying, "Everyone, auditorium, hurry," and how all the teachers in every grade were given 5 minutes at the assembly to explain the new no-talking rules to their students, and how loud and confusing it was as they did that, and then how completely quiet it got when the principal announced, "Silence starts now." And it might be enlightening to explain how Mrs. Hiatt had changed the contest so that the kids in kindergarten through 4th were competing grade against grade to see who could say the fewest illegal words during the next 23 hours, and why she thought her way was better than boys against girls. And it might be thought-provoking to explain how Dave felt about all this, how he felt that he was sort of like Gandhi, and how Mrs. Hiatt was sort of like the British Empire, and how he felt like had been a great victory, with liberty and justice for all, which included Mrs. Hiatt herself. And Mr. Burton. There's a lot to be told about him, because he went completely stratospheric. He spent the last 24 hours of the contest scribbling down notes, taking photos, using a little handheld recorder to capture as many 3-word sentences as possible. He collected so much great material that he began thinking that he could not only write that paper for his human development course, he could practically write a whole book about the way the kids and teachers at Laketon Elementary School had changed the way they expressed themselves. Changed their view of language itself, what it is, how it works, how communication can take so many different forms. And speaking of human development, it might be fun to explore why the very youngest kids could not even imagine how to go without something as amazing and powerful as talking, not even for 10 minutes, which is why the whole kindergarten was immediately excused from the activity. And how about Thursday morning, when the boys reported 0 honor system word goofs, and the girls reported only 1. Telling how Dave and Lindsay reacted to that news would be revealing. And then it would certainly be fun to peek at the challenges Mrs. Hiatt faced as she kept to a strict diet of 3 words at a time. On Wednesday afternoon and again on Thursday morning, she talked with parents, with the superintendent, with the principals of other schools, with the electrician who arrived to repair the milk cooler, and of course with her teachers and with hundreds of students, all of whom thought it was great to have a principal who just might be a little bit crazy. In fact, the story could jump a whole week ahead, or even months ahead, to see the way the 5th graders completed the school year as kinder, more careful talkers and thinkers. Because there's absolutely more to tell. There's always more. But as tempting as it is, it's not the time to tell about that, because this is the time to jump right to 5th grade lunch on Thursday, right to that point when the original contest was coming to an end, right to the moment of truth when the boys and girls were getting ready to compare their final scores. Because with all the goodwill and the happy vibes that swirled out of Mrs. Hiatt's change of heart, plus the excitement of having the school the whole school go quiet, you might think that somehow the 5th grade boys against girls contest didn't matter anymore. But it did. Remember when Dave stood up and shouted at the principal on Wednesday, "Did you think no one was counting?" Not true, everyone was counting. Dave had said 30 words, grand words, brave and true. However, all but 3 of them were illegal. At 12:14, 1 minute before the end of the contest, the cafeteria was silent. Every 5th grader was watching the second hand on the big clock, and so were all the 5th grade teachers, and Mrs. Hiatt, and the custodian, and the school secretary, and the school nurse, too. No one wanted to miss this moment in the history of the Untouchables. Dave and Lindsay sat across from each other at the same lunch table ready for the big tally. Dave dug around in his back pocket and found a crumpled sheet listing all the points against the girls, and Lindsay pulled her little red notebook and pencil out of her backpack, and she bent over it, adding and scribbling away. Glancing down, Dave saw something poking out of the top pouch of Lindsay's backpack, a huge permanent marker, a red one. And Dave had no trouble at all imagining a big L on his forehead, because he already knew that the final score for both teams, and he was sure Lindsay did too. With just 15 seconds to go in the silent cafeteria, Lindsay stood up and looked down at the red notebook, took a deep breath, and she talked. "I have to say this, my whole opinion changed about boys. You really did the honor system great, and being quiet, also great. Everyone together, so thanks." And then the second hand pointed straight up. And it was 12:15 and the contest was over. A yell went up that nearly peeled the tiles off the floor. Kids jumped out of their seats and ran and stood bouncing face to face with groups of friends, and everyone jabbering faster and louder than human beings should ever, laughing and nodding and telling everyone everything they were thinking and feeling. And the louder it got, the louder everyone had to talk to be heard above the rising tumult, and the sound spiraled toward that point where dogs run and stick their heads under the sofa. And amid the burst of joy and noise and confusion, Lindsay shouted to Dave, "What's the official count?" Dave nodded, cupped his hands around his mouth, and bellowed, 47 against the girls. Lindsay looked at her notebook. She didn't try to talk. It was too loud for that. She turned the notebook around, and at the bottom of the page, a number was circled. 74 against the boys, a huge defeat. Lindsay gave him an odd little smile, and Dave was ready for the teasing to begin. She shouted, "You didn't count?" He was confused. Count what?" Lindsay yelled as loud as she could, "What I said at the end." Dave shook his head. "What?" The sound around them was deafening. Lindsay flipped a page and then turned the red notebook around so Dave could see it. And there was her whole little speech, written out word for word. The last word was thanks, and just above it she had written the number 27. Dave nodded slowly and stared at the speech and then saw what Lindsay had done. He did the math in his head. 7 plus 7 and carry the 1. She had made the contest an exact tie, 74 points for each team. And their private war to see who got to label the other a loser. Also a tie. Her 27 words matched the illegal ones he had yelled at Mrs. Hiatt. Was it all too perfect? Of course it was. Had Lindsay messed with the score against the boys to make it add up that way? Without a doubt. Would there be a big investigation? Not likely. Dave kept looking at the notebook. Lindsay's speech was filled with cross-outs and changes, chosen the last words so carefully, making each one count. He wanted to say, "I owe you big time." He also wanted to say, I guess I'm pretty much of an idiot, aren't I? And most of all, he wanted to say what she'd already said. Thanks. But Dave and Lindsay just sat there grinning at each other in the noisy cafeteria, and neither of them said a thing. Not one word. And that is the end of our book. We have come to the end of our read aloud for our online learning. Yay, that's exciting. I hope you guys like this story, and I hope you take some time to think about what your favorite part was in the book, and if you recommend it to a friend, who would you maybe recommend it to? Thanks for listening, and I will see you guys very soon.